Okay, as usual, any questions, just put them in the chat. You can shout out as well if you're brave enough, but Scott will be monitoring the chat. Scott's around for the first hour. This is normally a 2 hour lecture. I'll try and keep it short and sweet and try and skip past the slow bits. If you have any questions, just pop them in the chat. Scott, when you leave, I will. Well, actually, I might do it now. Who else have we got in here? Kate, I'm making you a co-host so that you can field questions once Scott leaves. Okay. Cool. All right. We will kick off. Right. Ecology of bats. So I've kept this to British bats for the most part, but I have talked in general about various aspects of bat ecology and how that varies sort of on a global scale. This is what we're going to go through: origins and flight, echolocation, diet and feeding, roosting, life cycle, and conservation status, and sort of a bit about legislation. The conservation status stuff is again a little bit UK centric, as most of it is. So first of all, about the origins of flight. So here's a few facts for you. 1 in every 5 mammalian species is a bat. The one of the interesting things that with the COVID epidemic that people have talked about is about the how bats are vectors for disease and they carry more diseases than any other group of animal. And there's a very good reason for that, is because there are so many species of bats. It's literally like there's so many of them. One in every 5 mammal species is a bat, and so that's people sort of will talk about what vectors for disease they are, and it is just because of the abundance of species, and so you have to kind of see things in context. So if anybody ever gives you that argument about bats, then you know what to say now. So only the rodents are more diverse. They are the only mammal capable of true flight. We're going to talk a bit about flight and different types of flight style adaptations shortly. They're on every continent except Antarctica. And so 1,300 plus species globally. I think that's a solid 1,400 now. I think but they're being discovered all the time. I mean, you might have seen in the news recently there was a new bat discovered, sort of quite a gingery bat. I believe that was it in Africa, Scott? The new bat that they discovered, that bright, beautiful red bat. Anyway, they're discovering them all the time is the point. So at the time when Altrincham wrote his book in 2011, it was 1,110. So that's how quickly and that's how understudied they are, and that we're still discovering new species all the time. So around 40% of those species are under some type of threat. So and we'll go into conservation status later on, but basically that they're either vulnerable, near threatened, endangered, critically endangered, or data deficient, which is probably just as bad as any of the others, because not only might they be threatened, but we actually don't know how bad the situation is. And you'll see quite a number of our species in the UK are also data deficient. And obviously, like many species, like most things, the diversity is highest in the tropics. And the further north you go in latitude and altitude, the fewer bat species you get. But that's the case for most taxa, to be honest. So, why is this not going forward? There we go. So, bats are broadly classified into 2 groups. You'll hear them spoken about as a megabat, so Megacoroptera, and microbats, Microcoroptera. These days they're talked about as Enterocoroptera being the megabats and Yangocoroptera being the microbats. They were recently reclassified, so relatively recently it was thought that the horseshoe bats, Rhinolophus, were in the microbats, being little and being insectivorous. And so with DNA analysis, that's recently been reclassified, and I will, if I can find my mouse, show you. So this was the former classification, the way that things were broken down. So you had your megabats here, and then everything else in the Microcoroptera there. So from 2002, this was the reclassification, and you can see the Rhinolophidae are firmly placed in the same group as the megabats. So with the other like our other bats, which are all of our other species in the UK, Vespertilionidae are here, are microbats. So we don't get any. We do get megabats here, but they're itty bitty megabats. So just to give you an idea of where bats fall in amongst other animals, this gives you a broad idea here. So you have your Yintero and Yangochiroptera, and this is basically how they fall into these. Bats are actually more closely related to pangolins than they are to things like shrews and mice. So looks can be deceiving, is the point. So they share a common ancestor with pangolins more recently than they do with other insectivores. And this is the way that the classification of, I've just used nocturnal bat as an example. This is the way that there are things like, subfamilies and subclades for the way that taxa are classified. But generally speaking, this is kind of the way it breaks down. So the oldest fossil bats that we have to date are from the Green River Formation from the early Eocene, which is about 50 odd million years ago. And you can see from these that they look very similar to you look at that fossil and you go, oh, that's a bat fossil. They've got the wings supported by elongated finger bones. And generally speaking, so bats are relatively unchanged since 50 odd million years ago. So there are some differences, though, between this 51 million year old one and the 52 million year old one, which we'll go into in a minute. And that gives us some clues to the way that things evolved with bats and in the different groups of bats. So there are two different theories of the evolution of flight. There's a cursorial theory of evolution, the idea that dinosaurs or early birds developed flight by running and jumping to catch prey, and then those having the type of feathers and the ability to successfully jump further, caught more insects, those traits were passed down, etc. So that's the cursorial theory. And the other one is a bit like what you think about flying squirrels would do with climbing up a tree and then jumping and gliding. And then that gliding flight would have then subsequently developed over millions of years through the process of natural selection. The ones that were good at it succeeded and passed that trait down to their descendants. And they developed flight that way. And that's called the arboreal, being they climb trees and jump off, basically. So Onychonicterus gives us some clues about how this actually might have happened. So it was pretty small, 27 centimeters. And one of the things that is quite interesting is if you look at the not the illustration, but look at the fossil itself, you can actually see the claws on the end of the fingers. So bats now only have a claw on the thumb. So if you did the Bat ID webinars, you will have seen the pictures there. They have a claw left on the thumb, which helps them to climb. And obviously claws on their feet, but their finger claws have been lost. But Onychonicterus still had his finger claws, and I think that the inference of that is that this was a climbing animal. So long hind legs, shorter forearms than modern bats, so they hadn't quite developed the elongated wings, but they were still very well adapted for climbing. So the skulls of these early bats very closely resembled what we think of as fruit bats today. So they had that kind of little puppy dog face. And they did not have an enlarged cochlea, which is we'll talk a bit more about that. It's to do with echolocation. All right, so here you go. There's just some close pictures of the claws of the hind feet of a Dor Benton's bat and the epic thumbs of a nocturnal bat for you to have a look at there. And here is the wing of a modern bat, and as you can see, that's its the fifth digit, the pinky finger, so what we would call the proximal the proximal digit, because it's closest to the body. So, and you can see that there are no claws at the end. It's just a nice smooth finger. So Onychonicterus and Triarchus, which was another 63 million years ago, so we're going from quite significantly 10 million years back in time, was Triarchus, and this was like a tree dwelling a tree dwelling creature that we think is a good analog for what the ancestor of modern bats might have been. And they were both derived, Onychonicterus and Triarchus came from these tree-dwelling shrew-like animals. The closest analog for living today, as for the niche that this animal filled, is the African palm civet. So they basically do this thing where they climb up on trees and they'll drop down on their prey. And it's that kind of sort of behavior that engenders those type of evolutionary moves forward in doing things like developing skin membranes to make that more accurate, or make themselves more maneuverable, or to give themselves more lift for longer. And here you go. So this is again a flying squirrel. You can see this kind of this stretched membrane between the limbs, which obviously is very effective at giving them the ability to glide. Or are they sugar gliders? I don't know whether flying squirrels and sugar gliders are the same thing. Fill me in if anybody knows. But anyway, this illustration is really cool because
they're not the same thing.
They're not the same thing. Thank you, Scott. So, but same MO basically. They jump and glide using stretchy wing flaps. So here is a hypothetical illustration of the evolution of the stretchy wing flaps, which if you've watched the ID, you'll know is called the patagium. So this is compared to an embryonic myotis bat here, and you can see that what they think might have been this transitional stage would have looked strikingly similar in form to the myotis embryo. So Onychonicterus. So we're going from further back in time towards modern time now. Onychonicterus, 52 million years ago, could fly, full flight. He had claws still, but did not echolocate because it did not have an enlarged cochlea, which is the echolocation organ. So then Ecology, very, very shortly after, on a geological timescale, 1.5 million years later, this one did not have claws, and also did not echolocate. But then by 48 million years ago, Paleochiropteryx had these enlarged cochlea and had developed echolocation. So there had been until this had really sort of been nailed down. There was a lot of kind of what came first, flight or echolocation. Did they echolocate, and then they began to fly later on. And we're pretty. The fossil record is pretty indicative that flight happened first. So I've got a few notes here. So all bats, including the wait on the next slide. Notes for the next slide. So right. So the Yinterochroptera, they have an enlarged cochlea when they're a fetus. So all of our sort of like the Yangterochroptera, the microbats, they're echolocating as you well know, but echolocation is far less frequent in fruit bats and the megabats, but they do have this enlarged cochlea when they're fetuses. And they will use clicking to navigate. They do have some color vision, whereas the non-frugivorous bats tend not to have such good color vision. It's not quite as good as, say, our color vision. They don't have as many rods for color perception as we do, but they are generally more crepuscular and out in daylight, and so require a little bit of color vision, and generally speaking they've got big eyes and they're a lot less dependent on getting around using an acoustic landscape, although they will still use clicking to navigate. So they some of them will use flicking of their wings, and some of them will click their tongue, and they it's called non-laryngeal, so they're not echolocating out of their mouth the same way that the microbats are. But they have lost ability to truly echolocate, but they still have this residual perception that they use, and
It's
they do
more
have a
echo orientation,
yeah.
like how shrews use it. It's not actually echo location. It's so the bat can figure out where it is as opposed to where it's going.
Yeah,
If that makes
exactly.
sense.
And it's not something doing things like homing in on food or anything on a fine resolution. It is literally just navigation and just orientation, as Scott said. So it's not true echolocation. So what we know, what the fossil record tells us, is that bats were flying and recognizable as bats at least 52 million years ago. And probably sometime before then, because obviously it would have taken some time to actually to develop that that flying ability. So it's the fossil record supports the arboreal theory of the evolution of flight in bats, and we know that flight came before echolocation. It's likely that they were initially diurnal, and then they became nocturnal to exploit the niche of, or to avoid competition and predators. But basically, there's there are no other birds, for example, that will eat the same type of foods are they're only out in the daytime by and large, and so there was a huge gap for them to exploit. And if there's one thing that mammals are really good, that the fossil record for the Cenozoic tells us, is that they are really good at exploiting gaps in niches. And so echolocation came later, and then later on still, the megabats lost that ability to truly echolocate, although they still retained some acoustic landscaping. So to go into
the Morgan, there's been a paper published recently, like literally a couple of weeks ago, that actually suggests that the majority of megabats never actually evolved echolocation in the first place, as opposed to losing it.
Really?
Because the cochlea isn't present in their embryo.
You sent that to me?
If he posted it on LinkedIn a couple of weeks back.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Wow.
So it actually looks like it evolved. It didn't evolve at all in megabats until
Interesting.
Yeah. So, but obviously you've got
Okay,
the
just
problem
ignore the last 10 minutes.
Yeah. Intra and you've got other cladistic issues, but yeah.
Yeah. So this is why what's really useful is like DNA. What DNA just solves so many things that we relied on just morphological taxonomy for, and the fact that we've completely changed in recent years our perception of what is a megabat and what is a microbat. But obviously like what Scott's referring to is, I haven't read the paper, but I he's referring to the bats that are in the Enterocroptera, which don't echolocate. Obviously, there are a lot of bats in the Enterocroptera, like horseshoe bats, which do echolocate. So, anyway, we'll talk a bit more about echolocation. So, people talk about bats being blind. Bats are not blind. Bats see about as well as we do, which in the dark is obviously not that brilliant thing. They specifically, I'm more talking about the Yangteroptera. I'm talking about microbats here, but they generally speaking speak in black and white. Sorry, I'm going to turn my sound off on my phone. So they see in black and white. As I said before, the fruit bats have got this color vision, but it's dichromatic. They don't have as many color perceiving features that we do in their eyes. So they can not see ultraviolet and they can't see red light. And generally speaking, it's for daytime navigation. Although generally speaking, the general prevalence for color vision in mammals is that it develops in frugivores, because we need to know when fruit is ripe and good to eat. So there's that. So echolocation. Bats emit high frequency sounds. Obviously, they're not the only animals that echolocate, but we're talking about bats specifically. The echoes of those sounds bounce back, and the rate and direction that those echoes bounce back to the bat gives the bat a three-dimensional perception of the world around it. So if you imagine, the way I always describe this to kids if I'm doing like a bat talk is that if I threw a bag of flour, I exploded a bag of flour in front of me towards the people in front of me. The people who would get covered in flour first are the ones closest to me, and so and I would see that happen because that would be the light from their face bouncing back, and I would see that happen like that. So the idea is they send the sound out and it bounces back at different rates when it hits different things, and so that's what gives them the three-dimensional view of the world using sound. So they use this to navigate, to find food, but they also use it to socialize with each other. So generally speaking, we've got a sonogram here, and so this is roughly the range of the bats in the UK that they will begin echolocation. The lowest ones are kind of down here in the 15 kilohertz range. You will get social calls that drop very low indeed. The navigational echolocation tends to be down for nocturals down at around 19, 20 kilohertz. And goes all the way up to over 100 kilohertz for lesser horseshoes. So when we look at a sonogram, it's a picture of a sound. And the picture of the sound is drawn by the change in frequency on the axis here, and the constant frequency of the time on the x-axis. And so this is the length of the call, and this is how the call goes from high to low, or from low to high, depending on the shape of the sonogram. But this is a common pipistrelle call, and we talk about bat calls being made up of two features. One is constant frequency, which is how long the call persists for, and the other one is frequency modulation, which is the change in frequency over the duration of the call. And so if a bat has, well, actually I'll skip to the next slide. So here is a naturalist bat calls, and naturalist bat calls have got very, very little constant frequency. It's a very short call, but they have a lot of frequency modulation. So it's a very tall call, very long, but it's not drawn out. So it's a very, very short, sharp streak. And then the in sharp contrast to that is lesser horseshoe bat, which is almost all constant frequency and very little frequency modulation. So if you check out, if you haven't already, check out the Sounds Analysis Sundays videos. Give you a bit more information about that. I'm not going to go into too much detail about echolocation. But even calls of the same shape, which are, they tend to be very species specific, especially when we're lucky enough here in the UK that we've only got 17 species, and most of them can be separated on their sonograms. I mean, there are quite a number of species which can't, but you can certainly get down to genus level. Now, these are two different pipistrelles calls. So the bottom ones here are like they're sitting on a shelf at about 45 kilohertz, and these ones are sitting on a shelf at about, this looks like about 56, 57 kilohertz. And these are textbook common pipistrelle and soprano pipistrelle, soprano being higher, just like a soprano singer. So you have the same type of call. You can see from looking at these, they have this sort of like there's some frequency modulation and some constant frequency. If you zoomed it in, it would look more like this guy here. They're like shaped like a little tadpole or a hockey stick. But these bats are echolocating species specific frequencies. So they are the point at which the call is loudest is called the peak frequency. The peak frequency for common pipistrelle averages about 45 kilohertz, and for soprano around 55 kilohertz. Although this will change significantly. Watch Sounds Analysis Sundays, and there's a whole video on pipistrelle calls. So the advantages of high frequencies, it is more effective for small targets. So the smaller your species, the smaller your prey species, if you're an insectivore, then the higher, it's better to have a higher frequency of call, but it has very limited range. Low frequencies travel further. So your range is increased, but you have a much lower resolution, so it's better for large prey items. And then so the advantages of having more constant frequency, the long calls, which are typical of horseshoe calls. And you compare that to, say, a nocturnal call, which is a lot of constant frequency, but the horseshoe call is very high frequency and the nocturnal is very low frequency. So they both have precision. They can both tell Doppler shift, which helps them to find moving prey. But with the higher frequency, you get greater precision because their prey are smaller, so they're after little bit itty bitty crane flies and stuff like that. Whereas nocturals are they're after beetles and things like that. So bigger prey. So they both have CF calls, but one of them is significantly higher than the other. And then with frequency modulation calls, they get more information. So they can identify their prey a lot more easily because they get a lot more information in a very, very short space of time. And then you get bats that are really well adapted to echolocating very quietly on purpose. So they have these large ears and large eyes, which allows them. We're talking about stuff like gnats bats and brown long-eared and grey long-eared in the UK. That they're after prey that would be alerted by a much louder call. So they're echolocating quietly, and they have these massive ears so that they can hear the quiet return of their calls to help them to exploit that niche and go for these prey that other bats are unable to exploit. So the other thing that I wanted to touch on briefly is social calls. So these are a couple of examples of social calls. So what you can see here, hopefully, yeah, you can see my thing. I don't know, Scott, are you annotating, Scott? Are you able to?
Yeah, I can annotate.
Thank you. If you just pick out the BLEs as opposed to the pig calls in that top one. So the top is brown long-eared bat is what I've put it in there for, but there's also some soprano pipistrelle in there just being annoying. So those are your standard calls that Scott has circled there. But in between those, there are clusters circled in yellow of little trills, and they are social calls, and they drop down. And they, if you listen to it, we go into more detail on this in the Sound Analysis Sundays. We do a whole thing on social calls. And then below, you can see these are all Dor Benton's calls, but they very, very tall streak calls, which are very, very straight, are their standard echolocation calls. And then Dor Bentons have got these beautiful sort of an upside down V. And they're one of the only bats that do that. If you get that, you can be very sure that you've got a Dor Benton social calling. They have these beautiful inverted V-shaped social calls. And all of these are ultrasonic, so you wouldn't hear these without a bat detector. When you have a bat in the hand, then you do hear them sort of shouting, and because they're echolocating and their distress calls are very, very low frequency indeed. But generally speaking, you've got to have pretty good hearing to hear social calls. Although Scott claims to be able to hear them all the time. Claims. The other thing is, and this is the point, I've taken some stuff out of this just to kind of like make this a little bit shorter. But please do go and check out the Sound Analysis Sunday videos. I know they're long, but you will learn some stuff. But the idea is that people describe different bat sounds as having these different attributes, whether they're wet or dry, whether it sounds like burning stubble, whether it sounds like aliens, or warbling, whether it's chip chop. And then these are all words that we use to describe the way that bats sound to us. But those are very, very relatable to the shape of the sonogram. So the more CF that a call has, the wetter it sounds. And the drier and the less CF it has, the drier it sounds. So when you have a Dor Benton's bat, a lot of people say that sounds like burning stubble, like a crackly, dry burning sound, as if you were burning hay. And it sounds dry to us because synesthetically we apply the word dry to it because it doesn't have the constant frequency, whereas we describe pipistrelles as having a wet sound. Sort of sounds like someone it can sound like someone like dropping a wet towel on the floor sometimes, but very, very, like rapidly. And that's because they have a lot of constant frequency in their call. So, right, so that's the cliff notes of echolocation. So a bit more about diet and feeding. Diets amongst bats worldwide are incredibly varied. All of our bats in the UK are insectivores, and so we don't really come across the other ones very often. But you get carnivores. There are bats that eat frogs, fish, and there are bats that eat other bats. Frugivores, although most frugivores, if they do, if they're and nectivores to an extent as well, they do have a certain amount of their diet which includes sort of collaterally consumed insects as well. And of course, you get sanguivores. There are 3 species of vampire bat, so they are particularly well adapted, and we go into a bit more detail in a second. Then there's feeding styles. So there's catching insects while in flight, which we call hawking. Doing these steep dives to catch prey, stooping. So like we talk about peregrines stooping. So it's the same thing. Nocturals do it. Gleaning is picking up insects from a surface. So you'll hear us talk about natterers and brown long-eared, for example, are gleaning bats. There are advantages to this because that means that your feeding, your window of feeding during the season is longer because you're not reliant on volant prey. You can pick things off of surfaces like spiders and things. So they tend to be able to eat a bit further into the autumn, early winter compared to other insectivorous bats. And trawling, picking up prey from water surfaces. We know that tormentons do that. Oh God, gone too far. Okay, so there are a lot of technical terms for wing shape with bats. I'm going to just skip past this, but just to talk about the fact that wing shape requirements, that your feeding style determines what type of wing would be really good for you to have. And so as a result, that those are the type of wing shapes because of their feeding style, because of the niche they're trying to exploit, that they have shaped the shape of bat wings over the course of evolution. So if you're a hawking bat, like a nocturnal bat, you require speed and maneuverability, and so you want to have long wings and a high aspect ratio. So if I just go back up, the aspect, wingspan and wing area. So the faster speed is a higher ratio, right? So the idea is that you want to have really good wingspan, and if you have really good wingspan, you'll fly faster, which means that you have a higher ratio. So that's what the hawking bats need. Gleaning bats, and also the nectar bats and trawling bats. Nectar bats because they need to be able to hover a little bit. Gleaning bats need to be able to hover a little bit. They need to be able to have this ability to be able to slow down and to be very, very maneuverable at a slow pace. So if you think about something other animals that hover, kestrels and buzzards, they've got very broad wings. And so broad wings is what is required of a gleaning bat, which is why you get your brown long-eared bats have just got these beautiful broad wings when you compare them to something like a pipistrelle, or if you say look at a natterer's bat compared to a pipistrelle, the wings are very broad, and that just facilitates this ability to pick insects off surfaces. And to be able to do that, they got to be able to slow down, and they got to be able to hover a little bit. So carnivores, if they're going to carry stuff off, they need to have incredibly low loading to enable them to just have a lot of power. And so we don't see that in any of the UK bats, obviously, but it enables them to carry off prey. Look at this guy munching on his frog. Shocking. So here's a bit about the wing aspect ratio. So I put these in because they're a good example of a broad wing as opposed to a long wing. So high aspect ratio and low aspect ratio. Bit about feeding guilds. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but basically, the food that you eat and the way that you hunt it determines your feeding guild. And I've put there's references at the end of this. I can send people any of these papers, but basically, bats are classified. Many animals are classified into feeding guilds, but bats have been classified into. You can see here it's a product of the environment and the style of feeding. So open space, aerial foragers. So these will be hawking bats, nocturals. Edge space aerial foragers, pipistrelles. So if you think about their wing shapes, they've got the narrower wing shape, especially the open space aerial foragers. And they have this, so prey is often distributed over large spaces and is therefore difficult to find. They fly a long way. They have to be able to fly fast. They have to be able to fly efficiently. Um, Edge-based trawling foragers at a low height above water, so that's like Dorbenton's bats. And then these narrow space fluttering detecting foragers. It's a bit of a mouthful, but they're talking about uh, flutter detecting, being able to sense the movement of like moth wings and stuff like that. So anyway, we'll skip past the rest of this, but just the concept that they will fit into this feeding guilds, and feeding guilds can determine. Well, you can use feeding guilds to draw a lot of comparisons and analyses. So we've done that recently on a poster, looking at the feeding guild, the gleaning bats, and the difference in their weight change seasonally compared to non-gleaning bats. So other adaptations that bats have, skull shape. So it's variable, associated with trophic specialization, and sort of like, so you'll get, say for example, this vampire bat is a very good example, because he has a very very short muzzle, and he has a short muzzle because he's a lapping bat, so he doesn't want his nose to get in the way. He needs his mouth to be as forward as his nose is. There are other species sort of that their skull shape is very peculiar. Like you have something like a Florida bonneted bat, which are a bit like they're like a mastiff bat, and they have a very recessed jaw, and they basically drop down on their prey items. So everything about that bat is sort of like aimed downwards. Dentition is very variable. So again, vampire bats are a really good example because they're so specialized. They're a really good example of these morphological adaptations. So they have fewer teeth. They need to have very sharp front teeth, the incisors, to pierce their prey. But they don't have anywhere near as many teeth as other bats. I think they have 20. I don't remember. So large ears, as in brown long-eared bats, to enable them to be stealthy. Lengthened tongues in nectarivores. I should have put in a picture here of some nectar eating bats. They have amazing long tongues with a groove all the way down the middle to help them to lap up nectar. Groove lip in vampire bats. You can see this picture here. His little groove in his lip just facilitates easier lapping because he needs to be able to move his tongue in and out. And things like really like when you get trawling water trawling bats, they tend to have bigger feet. So for our bats in the UK, Dorbentons have got considerably large feet compared to other bats of their size. And you think about things like bulldog bats that actually catch fish. They have these enormous feet. So lots of different morphological adaptations. So here you go, vampire bat, groove lip, short nose, shortened tail membrane so it doesn't get in the way. He can sense temperatures. His saliva has an anticoagulant in it. They're actually looking at one of the characteristics of vampire bat saliva to look at its medical applications as an anticoagulant, and they've called this something as Draculin, which is quite amazing. And the dentition has become reduced because they don't need it. And also they have they're physiologically just to live on blood. They've got a lot of weird adaptations, so they because they need to be able to fly away afterwards. They need to be able to gorge themselves on it, so they have this ability to just process take what they need out of it and urinate really really quickly. So they're pretty awesome bats. So, I mean, other behavioral adaptations that bats do is finding places to forage, finding where the best prey is, communicating that information to each other. Most bats are very loyal to their foraging sites, and usually, say for example, so Dorbenton's bats are a good example. So they'll have their roost, and they go out to eat on the night, and they will go to sort of like 2 or 3 sites, and they don't sort of go exploring. They go to where the reliable food sources are. So these don't seem like crucial decisions, but it does affect their general health, and anything affecting their general health affects their reproductive fitness, and also affects their ability to actually make it through hibernation and the condition, especially with females, that they're in when they wake up after hibernation, because that's the point at which they allow themselves to get pregnant. And then basically a lot of where they forage and what they're doing behaviorally has to do with thinking about how they are spending their calories. So they need to be able to, especially with females, the idea of central place foraging and optimal foraging theory is that they basically have to balance how far they're traveling with the quality and quantity of the food that they get at their foraging grounds. And when that becomes even more crucial during the lactation period, when females have to go to their foraging grounds and then back to feed their young several times in the night, and so they burn a lot of calories flying. So it's better for them to be able to find a good food source near to where their maternity roost is. And the idea is it's just all cost benefit analysis: is how many calories am I burning versus how many calories can I consume, and how many calories do I need to be fit, to be able to reproduce, to raise my young, and then to hibernate at the end of the year in order to be able to make it through to the next year. Because especially with our bats here in the UK, they only get one shot a year, so it's not like other mammals of the same size, which will shrews can be pregnant with one litter while they're still nursing the last one. Um, so with regard to roosting and foraging, there's the idea of core sustenance zone. So that is basically the area around your roost which is required, the area of habitat which is required to sustain a bat or a population of bats. And so, and for that to be sustainable. So Bat Conservation Trust have gone into this, and then what's really good about this is that basically they have put the level of confidence that they have, and it's just another example of how little we actually know about bats in the UK. It's considering that we have such a good scientific and conservation community around bats, they are just incredibly difficult to study. Um, and in order to get really, really good qualitative data, you have to do things like radio tracking. And so we still have very poor confidence in this. But these are relatively educated guesses about how many kilometers of radius around the roost is required of good habitat to maintain the favourable conservation status of that roost. And so this is in the BCT Good Practice Guidelines, which you can download for free. But yeah, it varies for species. So some species require an awful lot. So if you look at, say, for example, barbastelle, they need 6 kilometers radius of good habitat. But then, other bats, we know very, very little. Look at the confidence. And I mean, the number of studies done is very few. And in some cases, so Dole Benton's, the number of bat studies was 7. So lots more work to be done. But what has been done is available and has been published and is feeding into things practically, which is great. So, for example, we've got a Dole Benton's bat. These slides are backwards. I should have the Dole Benton's bat first. But this is the core sustenance zone of Dole Benton's bats around Linley Woods, which is one of our trapping sites from the 2017 onwards. And we'll probably be going back there for swarming. We do catch a lot of Dole Bentons at Linley. We know they're using the caverns there. And this is an idea of, for those of you who are local, who know the area, there's Park Lime Pits. That gives you the idea, compared to the size of Linley or Park Lime Pits, how much habitat they're probably using, which is interesting because it takes all in Stubbers Green here and all this whole section of canal. But we also know from doing surveys down this canal that the bats are coming from further away than this, heading up in this direction. So interesting. There he is, Dole Benton's bat. So one of the other things that we have looked at with Dole Benton's bats is that we started to notice anecdotally that the bats at Linley Woods were very fat compared to the Dole Benton's bats at other sites. And we looked at, we're going to be looking at this at different resolutions and in the future, but just to give you an idea, the Linley Woods bats are statistically significantly fatter than they are at Dudley, for example. And so what might be going on, and we're not sure, is that because their ecology is so tied in with water, being trawlers, and looked at the amount of water around Linley and Park Line pits compared to the amount of water in the same area of core sustenance zone around Dudley. And as you can see, there is a significantly more water here than there is around Dudley. And this doesn't even count all of the area of water inside the flooded mine. So, right, roosting. So, bats don't make nests. Bats roost. They just hang up. And the type of the types of different roosts are myriad. They are, but broad brush, trees, foliage, caves, rock crevices, and even things like inside beehives, bird nests, and inside termite nests. And then there's altered nests like tents, which some of you might have seen in Scott's talk about the tent roosting bats in Costa Rica. And in each of these different types of things, they will also use analogs for these. So we'll go a little bit into detail when we get around to doing the endoscoping course. We go into a lot more detail about roosting features. So man-made features, which are an analog for natural features, obviously, because bats have been here a lot longer than we have. We've been making buildings and bridges for a very, very short amount of time compared to how long they've been roosting in caves. Buildings, bridges, culverts, quarries, mines, bunkers, tunnels, and bat and bird boxes. This just doesn't even scratch the surface, but yeah. So basically, we build stuff, bats move in. And then, so we've got trees. So hopefully you'll be able to, hopefully this will work. Anyone want to guess a species? Put it in the chat. I'm not doing any more until someone makes a guess. Yes, good job, Kate. BLE. This is a brown long-eared bat. This is in a tree in Sutton Park. This branch has not had a bat in it any time that we've been back since. Rather annoyingly, because it's a really nice feature. But yeah, this is a brown long-eared bat. Okay, and then we've got this here. This is a holly tree. Species, please. No one's gonna guess. Yeah, it is a pip. We think it's a common pip. So there you go. So yeah, some different tree roosts. Oh, hang on, sorry. What's going on here? In some places, this is I think this is an eastern red bat. In Florida, for example, there are very, very few like old buildings because everything's made out of plywood. There's not very many caves and stuff in South Florida, so a lot of the bats are foliage roosting bats, and so these are palm leaves, and they'll roost inside these dead palm leaves that hang down, and so just hang up there. And then these are a couple of pictures that Scott gave me to use for this of one of his tent roosting bats. I'm assuming this is Artemis watsoni. Scott, or is he gone? He's gone. Sunday dinner priorities. So yeah, this is one of Scott's little bats that he found in Costa Rica, and another one in a different type of shaped tent. Right, this should work. This is Linley Cavern, and these are Dor Benton's bats, I believe. So that's a man-made feature. That's a disused limestone mine. It's not a natural cave. Um, other things, we build stuff, bats move in. So this is a school that I did a survey of in Pembrokeshire, and the people had boarded up this window here, and then this is the inside of the window. And basically, this pipistrelle was roosting between the board. It wasn't even in the house; it was between the board and the window. So basically, by boarding up the windows and having it done badly with a gap, they basically had created a roost. And then this is inside a World War II bunker in Poland, a little barbastelle just hanging up. So they love stuff that we build, hang in. And these are all of the underground Nazi railroad tunnels at Neteperik in Poland. And these are myotis, greater mouse-eared bat, in very large numbers, as you can see. So bats will go in expansion joints, in gaps in brickwork. This is the very famous Congress Avenue Bridge. By the way, I will post a link in the WhatsApp chat later on. This month, one of the podcasts that I listened to called 99% Invisible did a special talking about the building of this bridge and the work that the engineer did with Merlin Tuttle to protect the bats. This is the 1.5 million Brazilian free-tailed bats, Tadarida brasiliensis, that live in this bridge. And my brother and my sister-in-law took me there a few years ago to see them, which is pretty cool. One of the interesting things is when you see like local governments actually making the most out of the fact that they've got bats moving in and embracing it, which is pretty cool. So this is the sign over the Congress Avenue Bridge, and then the sign for the bunkers at Neteperik with the bats in. Really neat. So for suitability, bats need, depending on the environment that they're in, they need temperature, and more importantly, they need temperature stability, especially when they're hibernating. So they just need to not have this crazy fluctuation in temperatures, and they need stable humidity as well, especially for hibernation. They need it to be at the right height, and they need it to basically be safe. They need it to give them to afford them shelter from inclement weather, and from disturbance and from predators. It needs to be big enough for the purposes of the roost. So if it's a maternity roost, then a little crack in a tree is no good, but a crack in a tree is perfectly fine as a transitional roost for a solitary male. And the number of other roosts nearby as well. We'll talk a little bit about roost switching and stuff. But yeah, so the aspect of the roost. So a lot of time it will be warmer if it's south facing, less of an issue in the tropics, obviously. And there are many different roost types. So the bats will use different roosts for different things at different times of the year. So a day roost is where they are sleeping in the day. A night roost is where they just hang up when they want to rest at night or if they want to eat something. Satellite roosts will be sort of, as it sounds, like from the main roost where they are, there will be smaller roosts around them. And then transient roosts that they're just using as they're, just there for a night or for 2 nights. And then you have mating roosts, and for some species, such as nocturals, for example, you have a harem, which is a male and all of his ladies. And dispersal roosts. So when the maternity season is over, then you get a lot of roosts as the maternity roost breaks up, and then obviously hibernation roosts. So if anybody ever tells you that a damp roost is not a good roost, then just remember this video of these 2 Dol Benton's bats with water running over them while they're hibernating. I will play it again. Right. And this is another roost of, this is what I would certainly have, I think this is an opportunistic roost because this is in January this was taken. And this brown long-eared bat is obviously not anywhere that's going to give him stable temperatures and shelter for the duration of the hibernation period. I think that this bat probably had been disturbed somewhere and had just gone for the quick and dirty place to rest during the day so that he could find somewhere else. And he wasn't there the next time we went back a couple of days later. So, anybody else want to guess this species for me? Do it. Be brave. Yes, another BLE. Kate, you're shit hot on your BLE identification. This right here is the tragus of his ear poking out. So if you're doing Bat ID webinars, you'll know what that is. And they sleep with their ears tucked under their armpits, which is amazing. And then roost behavior. So the fission and fusion behavior, roost switching is something that bats do a lot. Depending on the species, it'll be more or less than other species, but and depending on the type of roost. So transitional roosts and sort of roosts of day roosts of small numbers of bats will move around quite a lot. But even large maternity roosts will do roost switching. It's thought that this helps keep parasite loads down. It's thought that it helps to share information about. There are a lot of theories about it. It'll share information about food resources and various other things. Other things that behavior you'll see in roost is scent marking and anointing. That's been documented in nocturnal bats of rubbing their buccal glands on the roost entrances, possibly as an advertisement to all those ladies. Right, life cycle. So there are two reproductive strategies, broad reproductive strategies, being R selected and being K selected. So R selection is like frogs. So you have a short lifespan, but you breed like crazy. You have lots and lots and lots of young. So shrews are the same; they're R selected. K selected is when you only have one or a few young a year, but in order to be able to keep your population numbers up, to compensate for the fact that you don't have very many young, you have to have a long life. And so bats are K-selected. Bats have usually one young. They can have more. On the continent nocturals, for example, readily have twins, and different species in different in climates like ours. Then we obviously have a harsh winter, so we have what's called monoestuary. So you have one reproductive cycle in a year. There are other places where you have multiple. So we usually monoestuary, occasionally polyestuary, but that's usually in the tropics. And then, as I said, reproductive strategies of having a harem of females. Lysa's bats males will have a harem of up to 9 females in a mating roost. When bat box checks happens, you'll get to see that. So for monoestuary, the reproductive cycle happens like this. Swarming happens in August to September. Swarming is something that happens for, there's a lot of speculation about it, but generally speaking, it does serve some kind of social purpose. Bats tend to swarm where they hibernate, so it may be sharing information about hibernation sites. It also is likely to facilitate mating and mate selection. Not all bats swarm, not all bat species swarm. So in the UK, our main swarming species are Myotis species, and brown long-eared do it as well. Mating happens in September, October, and it's delayed fertilization, so which is different from delayed implantation. So something like a badger would use delayed implantation, which is where they mate, the egg is fertilized, and then that the egg doesn't get implanted until they're ready, until their breeding season. But in the case of bats, it's delayed fertilization, so the female simply stores the sperm inside her. So hibernation happens November to March inclusive. So bats will be starting to wake up on warmer nights now. One of the other things that happens regularly with Vesper bats is that the males will wake up during hibernation and have sex with the sleeping females. So we know that a lot of, and that's one of the reasons when you'll have seen when we talked about the sexual assessment about the epididymis. That's why sperm is stored in the epididymis into the winter, so to facilitate this this winter hibernation mating. So they wake up in April, and once they've been in a decent condition and it's warm and there's food around for a couple of days, they allow themselves to become pregnant. Pups are born in June, and they are weaned very bloody quickly. They are on the wing at 3 to 4 weeks. Young babies, and they develop their flight muscles in the roost by doing little push-ups and stuff. And then in August, the maternity roosts will disperse, swarming happens, and it all starts again. So birth and development, babies can be up to 40% of the mother's body weight. It's usually about 25 to 30% here in the UK. Vesper bats, and the mums can carry their pups and fly. They do grow very, very fast. As I said, they're volant at 4 weeks, which is pretty impressive. When you think about it, though, that the whole idea is that they have their babies, and they have to have weaned their babies, and their babies have to be in a condition so that the babies can get through hibernation when they're just a couple of months old. So it has to all happen very, very quickly, and so that's kind of like forced this lifestyle. So here's a few baby pipistrelles, and hopefully, if the video works, you will see him. Obviously, they're mammals. They feed on milk, and so these are being fed puppy formula from sponges.
Are they all common pets?
Yeah, I think so. So, super cute. Right, aging and lifespan. You might have heard about the idea of telomeres. I know, right? It is super cute. You might have heard about the idea of telomeres. So there is a Brandt's bat that was recorded because it was a ringed Brandt's bat, so we know how old it was, over 40 years old in the wild. This is an incredibly long time for a mammal of this size, and it is to do with this K selection rather than R selection. They have to be able to live a long life because mortality is very high and their birth rates are very low. So basically, their telomeres don't shorten, and and that's the thing that causes the aging process. So they don't shorten with age with anything like the way that they normally do. I think that Myotis bats are the longest lived at over 40 years, and with Rhinolophus, it is in the 20-ish years. But there are investigations at the moment into how exactly that works, because if you think about something like a shrew, or a mouse, or any other mammal that kind of size, the life expectancy with predation taken into account in the wild is probably something like 6 months, but a maximum of something like 2 years. So they're very, very long lived compared to other mammals of that size. Right, this is the last section. So there are 46 species of 12 genera in Europe. And there are 5 families, and you can see here that there are 3 that we don't have in the UK. So we just have Vesper bats and Rhinolophidae, which, as you know, are a Yinterochroptera. And globally, bats they're doing pretty badly. I'm not going to lie, they're doing pretty badly. Well, there's the critically endangered species are 1.8% of bats, 23 of them, which doesn't sound that terrible. But the problem is that when you add it all up, so 18% of bats, and bear in mind that most of the IUCN stuff is very out of date. But we're looking at 267 species when you add the data deficient species. So that's 40%. So only 60% of bat species are not under any kind of conservation concern. So this is some shiny graphs, which you can look up on the IUCN website if you like. So in Europe, we have 3 that are endangered, 7 more are vulnerable, and then 8 after that are near threatened. So 40% of European bat species are of conservation concern. So how are they doing in the UK? There's a 2017 State of the UK's Bats. I'm not sure if there's been one more recently. I don't think so. Here are the general trends. So generally speaking, the National Bat Monitoring Programme monitors particular species, and it thinks that most are stable or recovering. But this was back in 2017. So the data are insufficient for 7 species. That's 7 out of 17 species in the UK that we don't have enough data on. We think that common soprano and BLEs are all in decline. This is as of 2017, but an assessment has happened more recently than that, which we'll get onto in a second. So they are protected. So the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981 made it illegal to take, injure, or kill a wild bat, to possess any part of a bat. or to sell them, and to basically it just makes trade in bats and bat parts illegal. There are species action plans in the UK from 2010 for these species. That doesn't necessarily give them any further legal protection. No, these are just species action plans. So it would be like when you're putting it, you'd use that as evidence to indicate the requirement for robust mitigation schemes and things like that, because you'd say, oh, this is like a locally, um, this is a species action plan for this species. Um, so the habitats regulations, this is the European, what makes them a European protected species, piece of legislation to which we are still beholden currently, even post Brexit. So basically, this makes bats protected from disturbance, and it also protects their roosts whether or not the bats are present at the time. Does not, however, protect foraging areas or commuting routes, which is horrendous. So this is the most recent assessment of the bats that we have in the UK. In 2020, the Mammal Society produced an IUCN compliant red list of Britain's terrestrial mammals. So they're basically using IUCN kind of protocols to assess the state of our bats and how they are doing. And it's pretty bad, I'm not going to lie. Alcathay, whiskered, and Brandt's data deficient. We have no idea what's going on. Most of the bats are doing like least concern of what the data that we have, but then Serratina are vulnerable. Leislers are considered near threatened, which is interesting because the Annex 2 species in the UK are lesser horseshoe, barbastelle, and Bechsteins. And so those have been the ones that we have until last year have been the ones that would trigger a high conservation status assessment of a roost. So the idea is when you're looking at roosts as a consultant, you will need to decide what the conservation status of that roost is to be able to determine the amount of mitigation, for example, that needs to be done. And so generally you would be saying a high conservation status roost is a hibernation roost of any species, a maternity roost of any species, or any roost of Bechstein, barbastelle, or lesser horseshoe. However, this certainly puts a lot more emphasis onto Leislers particularly, but also Serratine. Quaker mouse are bats critically endangered in the UK. It's not a breeding species. There's one lonely guy, as far as we know. No one's found any more. So he's critically endangered in the UK. As you saw from the photos before of Netoperic, that they are greater mouse bats are abundant in Europe. They don't do badly. And the idea of this protection and disturbance, it's anything which then this is the actual text to anything. Oh God. Which is likely to impair their ability to survive, breed, reproduce, rear and nurture their young, hibernate, migrate, or to significantly affect the local distribution and abundance of the species. So it's not just pissing a bat off is disturbing it. Anything that you do, and that could, you would logically think, okay, putting up loads of lights along a commuting route would be disturbance. So it's but I don't think that this part of the law is really emphasized when it comes to mitigation, and generally speaking you don't tend to get an awful lot of consideration of things like commuting routes and foraging grounds when it comes to the very roost focused legislation. So the Habitats Directive protects all European bats, and there are 14 in Annex 2, as I've said, Bechstein's, barbastelle, lesser horseshoe, and we are required to consider them. So, core areas of habitats are designated as sites of community importance. So it is possible for sites to receive special designations for their protection for bats. But those are the Annex 2 species. Those are literally just barbastelle, Bechsteins, and lesser horseshoe, and there has to be a significant enough number of those to be able to qualify to get protection for as a site of community importance or a SAC for bats. So that's basically it. I'm happy to send any references or any information that you want, anything that I've mentioned that you would like to read, that Scott or I can send to you, then please let me know. I am happy to answer any questions that you have. Stop sharing. You can type questions or be brave and ask questions with your video on. You're all going to meet each other in real life in like 3 weeks anyway, so 3 weeks.
Same here.
Okay, I'm going to assume you got no questions. I'm going to assume you're all happy. Give me a thumbs up. Okay. All right, we're done. If you have any questions, you can stick them in the WhatsApp. I'm going to post some stuff in the WhatsApp. One of the things that I'm going to do is, because this is the last sort of like education webinar, although we do have the how multipass works, but that's a survey training one. What I'm going to do is circulate a feedback form, and that you won't have to do one for everyone you've done. It will just be a general feedback form for everybody who has been taking part in the webinars, just so that Scott and I can just keep improving these as we go, and just, it will give you the opportunity to give us some anonymous feedback, because it will be anonymous. So anonymous feedback, and to tell us what you think we did right, what you think we did wrong, what was pitched too high, what was pitched too low, all of those things. So we have tried very hard to just keep you occupied for the winter. So hopefully next winter we'll be out doing lots of endoscoping. So fingers crossed. But we have 4 or 5 months of bat surveys ahead of us now. So I look forward to seeing you all in a few weeks. And you will hear from me later on today, once I've uploaded this onto the website. Remember, you'll have the access to the volunteer password protected area, so you can watch this at your leisure. Let me know. I'm not going to remember who came today, so just drop me a message later on when I'm updating who's done the training course, and I will. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a print screen, and then I'll have a list of everybody. There we go. Okay, so that's it. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you all in a few weeks for multipass. Well, actually, I'll see you for multipass training online first, in a few weeks' time. But yeah, it's all happening. Spring is happening. I saw a bat last night outside my window on the canal. There was a bat alive and flying. It's all good stuff. All right. See you guys soon.
All right.